Hello guys, my name is Sharmin and today in this video we'll be looking at the CSS3 grid layout. Okay, so if you guys don't know what CSS Flexbox is, then I recommend watching that first because it will be easier for you guys to understand what CSS grid is if you already know what CSS Flexbox is. Okay, so I have a link in my description of my CSS Flexbox video. Go check that out first and then come and watch this one. Okay, so now you might have a question that if we already have Flexbox in CSS, then why we need CSS Grid? Okay, so here to answer your question, in CSS Flexbox, okay, you can lay out your items in only one dimension. Okay, what CSS Grid allows us to do is we can lay out our items in 2 dimensions using CSS Grid, and CSS Grid is very powerful. Okay, so without wasting time, let's see how the CSS grid works. All right. Okay, so here I already have created a div, okay, a container div named grid, and you have 6 divs inside of it which are your children. Okay, so and I have some styles given it. This is your margin and padding 0, okay, for the entire page, and here you have different background colors for the 6 divs that we have over here, right? These six divs over here, I've given them separate background colors so that you can see them easily. And here the grid container, okay, the main container from which we'll be controlling the children elements. Okay, so grid is powerful. So here we have given it some margin so that you can see it clearly, and we have given it a border of 6 pixels solid black. Okay, so it is visible. So this is what we have right now. All right, now to use CSS grid, what we'll be doing is we will be giving it a property of display grid, the way we give display flex in Flexbox, right? Similarly here we give it a display of grid, and when you refresh, can you see there is no change right now? So now to actually use this display grid, first we'll be seeing how we can lay out our rows and columns. Okay, so first let's have a look at our rows. Here you can use the property called grid template rows, and here for example you want 2 rows of 200 pixels each. Okay, so you have grid template rows for 200 pixels for the first row and 200 pixels for the second row. So when you save this and you refresh, can you see you have 2 different rows of 200 pixels each? Now here some people have confusion that if you give it a grid template row of 200 pixel, it might give it the width, but no, it doesn't give the width to your container, it gives height. Okay, so what grid template row does is 200 pixels is the height over here of your row. All right, rows are horizontal and columns are vertical, right? Okay, so this is how you define your rows, and for your columns you have the same property, but it says grid template columns, and here for example you want 3 columns of 200 pixels each. So you write 200 pixels 3 times and you get 3 columns each of 200 by 200 pixels. Okay, because you have a row of 200 pixel, because you have rows of 200 pixels and your columns are also 200 pixels, so each of your div is 200 by 200 pixel over here. All right, now this is how you define your rows and columns. All right, now if you want more amount of columns, now for example you have something where you have to give 20 columns, right? So you cannot sit down and keep writing 200 pixel 20 times, right? So for that, what we have over here is we have a repeat function which makes it easier for us to define our columns. Okay, so here what we will be doing in repeat is the number of columns that we want. For example, we want 4 columns and 200 pixels each, so this is how we use repeat. Okay, so here we say we want 4 columns, okay, of 200 pixels each, and when you refresh, can you see you have 4 columns of 200 pixels each? So this is how you can write this in short form. Okay, so here if you want 3 columns each, so you get the same output, right? Like the previous thing, we wrote 200 pixel 200 pixel 200 pixel, so that way. Alright, so similarly the same thing you can do with your rows as well. Repeat, and you want 2 rows of 200 pixels each. Okay, we need to give it a semicolon here. And can you see the same output? Alright, so this is how you use the repeat function. Okay, now in CSS Grid we have one more unit that is being defined, that is a new unit, that is the fractional unit. Okay, FR. Now for example, here you have 3 columns, right? They are of 200 pixels each. Now if you want these 3 columns to occupy the entire space, okay, of your container, and you want each of them to be of equal size, okay, so for that you can use the fractional unit, that is FR. Okay, you give it a 1 FR, and can you see it occupies the space of the entire container. Okay, your parent container's space is entirely occupied, and each of your div, okay, it takes equal amount of space. Okay, so you don't have to count and then divide it equally. So this fractional unit, okay, the FR unit, it really helps when you want things to be divided equally. Okay, so here if we don't use the repeat property, and like the previous thing, if we give it, if we want our first column to be of 1 fraction, the second of 2 FR, and the third one again of 1 FR, and you save, can you see the second column over here, that is our second and the fifth div, these are in the second column, right? So these div are double the size of your first div, or the third or the fourth or the sixth div, right? So they are double the size, so they are of 2 FR here, right? So this is how you can give variable sizes to your columns. All right, so let's bring it back to repeat 3, and then let's give it a 1 FR. All right, now after this was how you define your columns and rows. Now if you want to have space between your columns and rows, you have different properties for that. Now for example, if you want space between your columns, you use the property grid column gap. Alright, and if you give it a gap of 20 pixels, can you see you have 20 pixels of gap between your columns? And similarly, if you want gap between your rows, you can use grid row gap, and here also you can give it a gap of 20 pixels, and you can see you have 20 pixels of gap between your rows, right? Now if you have the same amount of column gap and row gap, you can use another shorthand property, that is your grid gap. Okay, and you give it a value of 20 pixels, and let's comment this and let's refresh this. Can you see there is no change? So what grid gap does is it will give equal gap to grid column, equal gaps between grid column and grid rows. So for this entire thing you can use this one shorthand property, that is grid gap. All right, so this is how you give gaps. Can you see we haven't touched any of our children elements, right? Children divs until now. We are controlling our entire grid using only the parent container. So this is how powerful the grid is. Okay, if you understand this, then it is very easy for you all to make complex layouts. All right, so this is grid gap. Okay, now after grid gap, let's see another property, that if you have now you have 2 columns of 1 FR each. Okay, now can you see you have 2 columns of 1 FR each, right? So we have defined 2 rows of 200 pixels, right? Now here the third row, okay, it is not being defined, correct? We haven't given any value that how much should our third row, like we here, can you see we have grid template rows. All right, here we say we want 2 rows of 200 pixels each. Now here our columns are 2 columns of 1 FR each, so it is only taking up 4 columns, okay, in 2 rows, right? So now the columns underneath of that, they take no space, right? So to fix that, like for example, in future, if you have something like, if you have new rows to add and you don't have those rows defined, then there might be a problem, right? So for that also grid has a solution, that is you can use grid auto rows, and you give it a value of 300 pixels for example. And now can you see if you have any new columns, okay, defined and if it has to occupy the next row, it will use this value, okay, grid auto rows. Your first two columns will obviously use this value, but any columns defined after that will use this value, okay, 300 pixels. And if you want it to be the same as the previous rows, it can be 200 pixels as well, okay. So let's add another div and see does that work properly or not. So if you save, can you see? Okay, so can you see when you defined one more column, it shifted to the next row and it has a height of 200 pixels, all right. So let's delete this and bring it back to normal, and let's make this 3 again. Okay, so this is how your grid auto rows work. Similarly, you can define your columns as well, okay, grid auto with grid auto columns. Right, so let's erase this. Okay, so now next, okay, and these columns, what you can do is you can even, let's copy this down, and you can even define your columns and rows in percentage. For example, you want the first column to be of 50%, the second one of 20%, and the third one of 30%, for example, and you refresh. Can you see it divides it properly into 50, 20 and 30, all right. But keep that in mind that this total has to be 100, okay. For example, if it's not 100 and you define one more over here, can you see it will go outside of your grid container, okay. So keep that in mind that the total of the percentage that you mention over here should be 100, all right. So this is how you can define it in percentage. So let's bring this back. Alright, so this is how you define your columns and rows. Okay, now what else we can do is here, for example, if you want your fourth div in place of your second div, what you can do here is, to do this, you need to understand grid lines, okay. This is important to understand if you want to align your items, okay. So here you have your rows, right. So this one, the line 1, line 2, line 3 and line 4, these 4 are your row lines, okay, and these 4 are your column lines. So always remember your line starts from here 1, 2, 3 and then 4, all right. So here what we have is we have 3 row lines, right, 1, 2 and 3, and we have 4 column lines, 1, 2, 3 and then the fourth one over here. Now how can we use that? Now what we want to do is we want our fourth child, okay, in place of the second child, right. So here for this, okay, so to do that, what we'll be doing is first we'll have to see that it is in the second row, right. We want it to be in the first row. So first let's give it a grid row start and then we say 1, all right. Can you see our fourth div moved over here, okay, in the first column, and you want it to end in the first column as well. So you can give it a grid row end of 2, okay. Even if you don't give it, that's okay because it is already between the first and the second one. Now in the column you want it to be over here, right, in place of our second div. So here you can give it a grid column start of 2, okay. This is our second column line number 1 and then line number 2 over here, right. So you want it to start from line number 2 and you want it to end on line number 3, right, of the column line 1, 2 and column line 3. So grid column start of 2 and you give it a grid column end of 3, and when you save it and you refresh, can you see you have your fourth div in place of your second div, right. You have the first div in its original place, your fourth div shifted to the place of your second div, and you have second div, third div, fourth div, the fifth and the sixth one going accordingly, all right. So this is how you use grid column and row lines to define where you want your div to exactly be. So here, in place of using grid row start and grid row end, you have a shorthand property for this one as well, that is grid row. Okay, just say grid row and you want it to start from 1 and then slash and then 2. Okay, this has to be the value from where you want it to start, and this one has to be the value for on where you want to end it. Alright, so this is how you use grid row, I mean the shorthand property. Okay, so if you comment this out and refresh, can you see nothing changes? So this is your shorthand property, and similarly for the column, you have grid column, and you want it to start from 2 and end at 3, right? Can you see no change? So this is how you use grid row and grid column to move your divs around. Okay, so let's comment this. Now for example, if you want your fourth div, okay, to start from here, okay, to start from your second column line and end over here, okay, on your fourth column line. So for that, what you can do is, here this is your column, right? So second column, and you want it to span until the fourth one. Okay, and you refresh. Can you see your fourth div starts from your second line, okay, your second column line, and ends at your fourth column line, right? So this is how you can span your divs inside of your grid. Alright, so you can use this, and let's give it auto rows so that you can see the last row also properly. So this will be grid auto rows of 200 pixels. Okay, now here, if you want your second div to span the entire width, okay, and the entire width of your container, so for that, what you can do is come to your second div over here, okay, or second child, and give it a grid column of 1/4. Okay, and refresh. Can you see it spans your entire, okay, it takes up the entire width, right? So now if you guys don't know how many column lines are there, you guys don't want to count the column lines, then what you can do is, instead of using the last, like the last number where the grid the column line ends, you can use -1. Okay, 1 to -1. What this will do is, this will start 1, okay, this 1 over here will start it from the start, and -1 will take it till the end. Okay, so this is how you span your elements. Okay, and in place of using -1 or any value, you can use span as well over here. So can you see, this is spanning 2 elements, I mean 2 divs over here, right? We had 3 divs, or you can span 1. Okay, this changes nothing because you're just spanning your original div, and then if you have span 3, it spans your entire space. Okay, so this is how you use span over here. Alright, so let's comment this, and let's bring our grid back to normal. Okay, so this is how you use grid row and grid column, okay, to move your divs around or span your divs or give it the required amount of width. Alright, now after that, we have our align items and justify content properties. Now, like similar to flexbox, okay, in the flexbox, how we had align items, right? So here similarly we have the same thing, that is align items, for example center, and we refresh. Can you see the items have been aligned in the center? And you also have justify content center again over here. So you won't see the difference because it is already in the center. And justify items, if you give it a center, you will see a difference here. Okay, can you see your divs move in the center, right? So even if you have this span, this will work same for even that. Okay, your second div is taking up your entire space over here. Alright, still it is in the middle. So this is how you use your justify content and justify item properties, and align items and align items and justify items property. Okay, so this is how you align your items inside of your grid container. All right. Okay, so now for example, if we have some content in our div, okay, right now we didn't, like, we had no content except for the div 1 2 3 4 5, right? So now for example, if we have some content inside of our div, how can we give it some width? Okay, meaning how can we give it different width according to the content? Okay, so here we can use min content, okay, this property over here, and when you refresh, can you see what this min content will do? It will take the longest word, okay, the longest word in your entire sentence, and will take up that much of width. And you can also use max content. What max content does is it will take your content in one single line, right? It won't move to the next line. So this is how min content and max content work. And you also have an other property, that is min max. If you want to define them together, that is minimum you want it to be 100 pixels and maximum 200 pixels. Okay, so this is two, or let's say maximum you want it to be 300 pixels so that you can see the difference properly, and minimum 200 pixels. All right, can you see this is 300 pixels, and when you inspect and when you increase the size, can you see after 200 pixels minimum is 200, right, over here? So when it's 200, it doesn't decrease its size. Okay, so this is how you use min max. Okay, all right. So now next what we'll be seeing is, can you see when you decrease the size, your layout is not responsive, right? It goes outside the width of your screen, right? And you don't want that to happen. What you want is, when you make this small, it should move to the next line, okay, if the width of the screen decreases. So for that you can use auto fit. All right, and when you refresh, now when you decrease the size, can you see when the size decreases, it automatically moves to the next line, right? So you decrease the size more, and this is your responsive layout, right? You get your responsive layout. And here also, inside of repeat, you can use min max over here. For example, if you want it to have a minimum of 200 pixels and maximum of 100 pixels, for example, and when you refresh, okay, not 100 pixels, this will, if you want a minimum of 200 pixels and a maximum of 1 fr, can you see when you decrease the size, it moves to the next line, right? So it takes up all the space, right? If you had 200 pixels over here instead of 1 fr, it would take 200 pixels of it, but you have given it 1 fr. So when the condition is minimum, it will take up the entire width, right? So here is your responsive layout, okay, in a few lines of code, right? If you didn't have CSS grid and you wanted to make this layout that is responsive also, and that has different number of rows, different number of columns, then it might have been a headache. Okay, you would have to use positions, you might have to use float, you might have to use so much of media query. So CSS grid is very powerful, and it makes it easy for you to lay out your items in 2 dimensions. So this is an important topic if you're learning CSS. Don't skip this. This is really helpful. It saves you from writing a lot of media query, and also it makes it easy to lay out your items in 2 dimension. Okay, so that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching, guys. And if you guys like my explanation, then don't forget to press that like button and do subscribe to my channel. I'll be coming up with such videos frequently. Okay, and I have an Instagram post on CSS Grid. Okay, so don't forget to check that out. I'll put the link in the description box, and do follow me on Instagram. All the links are in the description box below. So thank you so much for watching, and have a good day.